Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm Judy, the Armchair Traveler, with an Armchair Traveler Investigates episode for you. From the Loire Valley to the glittering courts of Europe, Francis of Angoulême, later better known to many of us as King Francis I of France, embodied the splendor, ambition, and contradictions of the French Renaissance. Francis was truly a man of contradictions, chivalrous and learned, proud and humble, restless, and easily swayed by flattery. He could inspire loyalty and resentment in equal measure, a monarch whose brilliance and failings were inseparable. In him, the Renaissance ideal met the realities of power and passion. Let's meet this man and learn about his life together, with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. Born in 1494 at Cognac, Francis was not expected to inherit a throne, but his mother, Louise of Savoy, always had her eye on the future. She raised him in the cultured but uncertain atmosphere of a minor branch of the royal Valois-Angoulême family. When Charles VIII and later Louis XII died without male heirs, the boy from Cognac suddenly found himself next in line for the throne. Francis was educated in the ideals of chivalry and humanism, taught to fence and hunt, yet also to read the poets of Italy. His imagination burned with the legends of Alexander and Caesar, but he was equally captivated by the art and philosophy of Leonardo da Vinci. From his youth, he dreamed not merely of ruling France, but shaping it into a realm of culture and glory. In 1514, Francis married Claude of France, the daughter of King Louis XII and Anne of Brittany. The union sealed the long-awaited merger of Brittany and France. Claude was modest and devout, a quiet presence amid a court notorious for intrigue. Her loyalty and kindness steadied Francis's early reign. When Louis XII died in 1515, the young Francis ascended the throne at the age of 20. His coronation at Rheims proclaimed a monarch of dazzling confidence, a warrior king determined to reclaim French glory in Italy and at home. Within months of his coronation, Francis led his army across the Alps to press his claim to the Duchy of Milan, a distant right traced back through his grandmother, Valentina Visconti. In 1515, at Marignano, he faced his first great test, a fierce two-day clash against the fearsome Swiss mercenaries defending the duchy. His own forces were a cosmopolitan host: German mercenaries, Italian artillerymen, and even cavalry, and Venetian allies who arrived just in time to tip the balance. Stories of Francis leading a daring charge spread quickly, yet these claims are embellished at best. The victory relied on the endurance, strategy, and the strength of his multinational army. Still, France, eager for a hero, embraced the tale of their young king at the front, inspiring his men and defeating Milan. The triumph secured Lombardy for France and transformed Francis's image from ambitious monarch to a warrior king. When he returned home, he was celebrated not only as a conqueror, but as a prince of the Renaissance. Francis's triumph at Marignano made him the most dazzling monarch in Europe, but also the most envied and feared. Two powerful rivals encircled him: Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, and Henry VIII of England. Together, they formed an uneasy alliance that threatened to isolate France. Charles V ruled over an empire that stretched from Spain to the Low Countries to Austria and included Italy and the Americas. His ambition was nothing less than the domination of Europe, and Francis's claim in Italy brought them into direct and lasting conflict. Theirs was not just a political rivalry, it was personal. Each young monarch saw in the other an obstacle, a contest between two visions of empire and glory. Henry VIII, restless for continental prestige, hovered between the two of them. In 1513, he had joined Charles against France at the Battle of the Spurs, a brief campaign that sent the French cavalry fleeing in disorder. Yet Henry also admired Francis's magnificence and wanted to match it. The tension came to its most glittering display in 1520, when the two kings met on wind-swept fields near Calais at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a summit of tents, tournaments, and feasts meant to dazzle all of Europe. For 2 weeks, Henry and Francis vied to outshine one another in splendor and chivalric grace. Queen Claude of France lent dignity and moral poise to her husband's courtly theater, while Henry's queen, Catherine of Aragon, observed the spectacle with wary diplomacy. Among Claude's attendants was a young Englishwoman, Anne Boleyn, absorbing the wit, elegance, and subtlety of the French court that would later transform Tudor England. For all its golden pageantry, the meeting produced no peace. Within a year, Henry aligned himself once again with Emperor Charles V, and the rivalry between them erupted into open war. Yet for that brief shimmering fortnight, Francis I stood at the center of Europe, the Renaissance king in all his glory. At home, Francis turned his court into the living symbol of Renaissance brilliance, a place where poetry, fashion, and flirtation were as powerful as diplomacy. Yet this glittering world carried its own perils. The king's mistresses, first Françoise de Foix, and later on Anne de Pizalou, Duchess d'Etampes, wielded immense influence, rewarding friends and punishing enemies with a word or a glance. Their intrigues could tilt alliances and spark jealousies that reached every corner of the realm. Against this shifting current stood Queen Claude of France, quiet, devout, steadfast. Though often overshadowed, she embodied the moral steadiness in a court intoxicated with brilliance and vanity. Her piety, charity, and devotion to family offered a counterbalance to her husband's restless ambition. Claude's household became a haven of dignity and virtue, the heart of order within a world of excess. Her example ensured that the legacy of her mother, Anne of Brittany, survived even amid the temptations of the Renaissance court. Queen Claude died in July of 1524, only 24 years old, after a short but exhausting life of nearly constant childbearing. In just 9 years of marriage, she had survived at least 7 pregnancies, producing 5 surviving children, including 2 sons, an heir named Francis after his father, and a spare named Henry. Each son was a potential heir to the Valois line. Claude's death left Francis without a queen at his side as he was preparing to invade Italy. There was no one to embody dynastic continuity or reinforce Francis' prestige abroad. Those closest to the court wrote that the king was greatly afflicted, withdrawing from public life for several days and later arranging for her burial with royal honors at Saint Denis. Yet his mourning was restrained in private, more an inward reckoning than a public display. Later chroniclers suggest that Francis may have regretted the way he had neglected his virtuous young wife, whose quiet steadiness had anchored the court amid his many passions. Without Claude's gentle authority and moral steadiness, the royal household became more open to rivalry and intrigue, as ambitious courtiers vied for favor in a less organized and orderly world. Her absence created a vacuum that other women, notably powerful mistresses and politically astute ladies-in-waiting, were quick to fill. At the same time, Francis was exploring new alliances through a second marriage, hoping to strengthen France's position in Italy and across Europe. Among the candidates were Margaret of Austria, the emperor's aunt and a regent of the Netherlands, and Eleanor of Austria, Charles V's sister. Margaret, then in her mid-40s, was probably long past childbearing and was mentioned mainly for diplomatic effect. A match like that would have symbolized reconciliation with the Habsburgs. Eleanor represented a more realistic marital prospect. The irony was unmistakable here. Even as Francis negotiated with members of the Habsburg family, he was preparing to fight them for control of Italy. When he crossed the Alps in late 1524, those talks were nominally still alive, but within months, at Pavia, his army was crushed by the troops of his would-be in-laws, and the French king found himself their prisoner. Even before her death, Francis was planning a new campaign in Italy. The French had lost Milan after a disaster in 1522 at Biocha, and his generals and courtiers pressed him to act. For France, Milan was more than land. It was honor, glory, and the prestige of the crown. Rivalry with Emperor Charles V was personal. The two kings, each determined to outshine the other. Convinced that another bold campaign would restore his honor, Francis gathered his armies and crossed the Alps, marching straight into yet another disaster. At the Battle of Pavia in 1525, the French army was annihilated by the disciplined Spanish tercios. Cavalry charges failed, infantry crumbled, and the king himself was captured. From his cell in Madrid, he wrote to his mother, "All is lost save honor." While he languished in jail, his mother, Louise of Savoy, ruled France's region. She raised armies, calmed unrest, and finally negotiated his release in the harsh Treaty of Madrid, surrendering Burgundy and sending her grandsons, Francis and Henry, as hostages. Those years in Spain left deep scars. The elder prince died young. Henry returned weary and withdrawn, finding comfort in the arms of a woman he had known before he had been sent away, Diane de Poitiers. Francis returned from captivity, humbled but unbroken. France had survived its darkest hour. The chivalric dream of glory had died at Pavia, but from its ashes a harder, wiser king would rise. Francis emerged from captivity transformed, cautious, calculating, and more determined than ever to defy the Habsburg emperor who had humiliated him. His first move was to undo the treaty he had signed in prison, declaring it forced and void. To restore France's power, he turned to diplomacy and to unexpected allies. Once friendly with Henry VIII, Francis now found England to be unreliable. Henry's shifting alliances and his quarrel with the Pope made him a dangerous partner. So Francis looked east, to the unthinkable. In 1536, he forged a diplomatic alliance with Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of the Ottoman Empire. This alliance between Christian France and the Muslim world shocked Europe, yet it was brilliantly pragmatic. Ottoman fleets harassed the Habsburg coast, while French envoys gained trading privileges across the Mediterranean. For the first time, European politics were reshaped by global diplomacy, and Francis stood at the center of it all. At home, the court itself reflected the new worldly complexity of the king's life. The gentle restraint of Queen Claude's era had given way to brilliance and ambition. Mistresses and courtiers competed for influence, and new figures arose to prominence, among them a young Diane de Poitiers, whose poise and intelligence impressed not just Francis, but young Prince Henry before he was shipped off to captivity in Spain. Their bond would one day shape the next generation of Valois rule. Though Francis's body was marked by illness and exhaustion, his vision burned bright. Unable to conquer with the sword, he would conquer with art, learning, and diplomacy. In the end, culture became perhaps his most enduring victory. Even in adversity, Francis never abandoned his dream of a France enlightened by art. He invited Italian masters to his court, among them Leonardo da Vinci, who crossed the Alps in 1516 to spend his final years in Amboise in a grace and favor mansion walking distance from the palace. Leonardo brought with him his notebooks, his designs, and 3 of his paintings, including the Mona Lisa, which would never return to Italy. In Leonardo's company and presence, the French Renaissance truly took root. At Amboise and later at Fontainebleau, Francis gathered artists, architects, and scholars who reshaped French taste in painting, sculpture, design, thought, and literature. He also welcomed the fiery Florentine sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, whose nymph at Fontainebleau, inspired by the form of Diane de Poitiers, or so they say, symbolized the sensual refinement of the age. Through his patronage, Francis transformed royal taste into national culture. He founded the library that would one day become the Bibliothèque Nationale, invited Italian masters to teach French artists, and made French itself the language of diplomacy and art. His court became a laboratory of beauty, a place where architecture, learning, and power intertwined to define what it meant to be a civilized person. In his final years, Francis seemed a man out of season, still magnificent, but worn down by war, illness, and some disappointment. The brilliant conqueror of Marignano had become a weary ruler, burdened by debt and the memory of his captivity. But he did not die defeated. He left a kingdom intact and secure, its borders relatively stable, its culture radiant, and its monarchy actually admired. Through art, language, and law, he had given France a new identity, confident, elegant, and distinctly its own. When he died at Rambouillet in March of 1547, he was 52 years old. His mother, Louise of Savoy, who had guided and sustained him for decades, was gone, but her legacy of resilience lived on in her son's careful governance. The crown passed to his second son, Henri II. For the elder Dauphin, Francis, named after his father, had died young, a loss that had shadowed the king's later years. Henri inherited a strong yet fragile kingdom, its treasury still strained by the war, its court divided by ambition, and its destiny tied to the will of his formidable queen, Catherine de' Medici. Francis's line endured through Henry and Catherine's sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, each a grandson of the great Renaissance king himself. But when Henry III died in 1589, the Valois dynasty ended, giving way to the Bourbons. Still, the spirit of Francis I never faded. The palaces he built, the books he collected, the language he elevated, all continue to define what it meant to be French, brilliant, bold, and yet profoundly human. Thank you for traveling back in time with me to 16th century France to explore the life of King Francis I. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps more people discover my work and will allow my channel to grow. Come back soon for another adventure with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide.